Just want to take a minute here and explain the difference between the genotype of an organism and try to differentiate that between the phenotype. And the main difference, up until most of history, up until fairly recently, is that we could not actually measure this genotype. We didn't really know what it was, and we actually didn't have a time to a way to measure it because this is literally the genes in question of this organism. It is literally the DNA or the instructions of how to build this organism. It is the blueprint, as they say. We now have computers that can take a little blood sample and figure out the entire DNA structure and show us what it looks like. But for a very long time, we had no idea how that worked. All we had to go on was the phenotype. And this is literally what you see and this is the looks. It's a very broad definition, but it's also the chemical things we can measure, and it's actually which genes are actually expressed. It's a more rigorous way of explaining what phenotype is. Genes that are actually expressed. There are actually some genes in the genotype or the actual organism that actually don't affect the looks. These are considered dormant genes, dormant or recessive. And so the genotype, to give an example, uh, uh, it would literally be the double helix of DNA, something like that. Just to give you a little visual, it's literally the ATCGAT genomic sequence that we've discussed before in class. The entire string would literally be the genotype. And the example of phenotype would be blonde hair or being tall. It's a pretty general one, but blonde hair versus brown hair is actually one that maps to one specific gene so that there is a link between them. But being tall is a pretty general thing that depends on many different genes. And Mendel with his pea pods, some of them were wrinkly and some of them were smooth. Wrinkly and smooth. So, to summarize, genotypes, you have to look at the genes. The word is pretty much in there. You would have to look at the specific gene or the nucleotide sequence. Uh, but for the phenotype, I don't really have a way of remembering this, but phenotype, you just have to take measurements of the macro scale. You just have to look at the organism or maybe take a blood sample other than a DNA blood sample, which would be genotype instead.
Now we must discuss what a genotype and a phenotype is. The genotype of an organism is the genetic makeup of an organism. The phenotype is the visible or expressed traits of this organism. In humans, a phenotype may be something like hair color. Now, how can friends choose each other on genotypic similarities if we can't see genes? Well, seeing as the phenotype is a product of your genotype, individuals who resemble you will typically have a similar genotype to you. And again, these scientists believe that genotypic and phenotypic traits may play a role in the development of friendships, and that friendship may play a role in the fitness of individuals in the population. And again, like we discussed, certain homophilic traits may be selected for. Homophilic traits are traits that you make friends or you have ties with those who are phenotypically similar to you.